At 5:41 on a Tuesday evening, I was 23 minutes from my house when Lucia Morales called and said something I had never heard in the 8 years I had known her. Her voice was shaking. "Mr. Avery, do not come home yet. And if Mrs. Avery puts papers in front of you tonight, do not sign them." I remember tightening my hands around the steering wheel and looking at the rain streaking sideways across Interstate 85 because nothing about that sentence made sense. My name is Thomas Avery. I was 66 years old, married 34 years, a father, a grandfather, and the owner of Piedmont Fire and Safety, a company I had built after spending 28 years with the Charlotte Fire Department. That afternoon I was supposed to fly to Atlanta for a 2-day industry conference, but thunderstorms had shut down half the departures out of Charlotte. When the airline pushed my flight to the next morning, I decided not to fight the airport crowd. I rented my car back out of the garage and started home without telling anyone, because I figured I could surprise my wife, Diane, with dinner. Lucia apparently knew I was coming because I had texted her that morning about a package arriving at the house. She had cared for my mother during the last 7 years of Mom's life, first as a home health aide, and later as the person Mom trusted more than almost anyone except family. After Mom died 18 months earlier, Lucia stayed on twice a week to help with the house, organize deliveries, and keep an eye on the old place when Diane and I traveled. She was 58, quiet, precise, and incapable of creating drama for entertainment. She was the kind of woman who put a fresh battery in a smoke detector before it started chirping and left the old one on the counter so you knew why she had replaced it. So when Lucia told me not to come home, I did not ask whether she was overreacting. I asked, "Are you safe?" She whispered, "Yes, I am in the laundry room. They think I left 20 minutes ago." That was the first moment my stomach dropped. "Who is they?" I asked. There was a pause long enough for me to hear a cabinet door close somewhere on her end. Then she said, "Mrs. Avery and Eric." Eric was my son-in-law. He had been married to my only daughter, Melissa, for 7 years. He was 36, polished, sharp with numbers. And for the previous 4 years, he had worked as controller at my company. I had brought him in because he was family, and because I thought family was supposed to make trust easier, not more dangerous. "What are they doing?" I asked. Lucia breathed out slowly. "There are papers on your kitchen table. I heard Mr. Sloan tell your wife that page 14 is the only page that matters. He said you never read the attachments. Then he said once you sign tonight, the warehouse can be moved before Monday." I pulled off at the next exit and parked behind a closed carpet store. "Lucia, I'm not even supposed to be home tonight." "I know," she said. "That is why they are doing it now. Mrs. Avery said the storm was lucky because you would be tired tomorrow and she could tell you the papers were only insurance renewals." A second later, my phone buzzed. Lucia had sent me a photograph. It showed a stack of documents on my kitchen island. On top was a cover page with the logo of a law office I did not recognize. Beneath it, partly exposed, I could read the words, "Durable Power of Attorney." Another sheet said, "Temporary Management Authority." A third said, "Voluntary Medical Leave Certification." I stared at those words until the rain on the windshield became background noise. I had never asked for a power of attorney. I was not taking medical leave. I had passed my annual physical 6 weeks earlier. I was still working 50 hours a week, still inspecting job sites, still climbing ladders when my operations manager yelled at me not to. Yet someone in my home had prepared documents describing me as a man who needed other people to manage his affairs. I told Lucia to leave through the side door and go home. She said, "There is one more thing. Mr. Avery," I heard Eric say. "Once the Eastover property closes, the old transfers disappear in the bigger number." I do not know what that means, but I wrote it down exactly. The Eastover property was our largest company-owned warehouse, appraised that spring at just over $1.3 million. Eric had no authority to sell it. Diane had no ownership in the business. I did. I sat in that parking lot with my phone in my hand and felt 34 years of marriage shift under me, without making a sound. Then I did the one thing Eric and Diane clearly had not planned for. I did not go home. I texted Diane that the airline had put me in a hotel near the airport and that I was too tired to deal with another drive in the storm. She replied almost immediately, "Probably for the best. Get some sleep, sweetheart." I read that sentence 3 times. Then I called the one person who had never once told me what I wanted to hear when the truth was less convenient. My attorney, Lena Hart answered on the fourth ring. I said, Lena, I think someone in my family is trying to take control of my company while I'm still standing in it. The next morning, at 7:30, I was sitting in Lena's conference room with black coffee I had not touched, and the photograph Lucia had sent enlarged on a screen. Lena had handled Piedmont Fire and Safety's contracts for 11 years, and she had the unnerving habit of becoming calmer as everyone else became more alarmed. She zoomed in on the document titles, read them twice, and said, First, you are not signing anything. Second, you are not accusing anyone yet. Third, we determine what exists, what has been filed, and what access Eric already has. That sentence probably saved me from making the mistake I was emotionally ready to make, which was driving home, throwing the papers on the floor, and demanding answers from people who had apparently spent months preparing theirs. Lena pulled our corporate file. Piedmont Fire and Safety was structured in a way I had barely thought about since we reorganized 5 years earlier. I was the sole voting shareholder. Eric, as controller, could initiate ordinary payments and approve operating expenses below a set threshold. But he could not sell real estate, transfer ownership, borrow against company property, or change bank signatories without my written authorization. Lena asked whether I had ever given him scans of my signature. I almost laughed because the answer was humiliating. Of course I had. We signed vendor certifications, municipal inspection documents, insurance forms, and payroll authorizations all year long. There were probably 50 PDFs on our server with my signature on them. Change nothing yet, Lena said. If we lock him out immediately, he knows you know. Let's see what he has already done. By 9:15, we had our bank's corporate fraud officer on the phone. By 10, the bank had quietly placed an internal alert on any request involving changes to authorized signers, new credit lines, or transfers above our ordinary limits. Eric would not be notified unless he attempted something. Then Lena called a forensic accountant named Paul Denning, a former bank examiner with the personality of a refrigerator and the eyesight of a hawk. Paul asked for 14 months of company disbursement records. I expected him to spend days combing through them. He called me 3 hours later. Do you know Red Clay Advisory? He asked. I said no. He told me Red Clay had received 7 transfers from Piedmont, totaling $214,600 over 14 months. Every invoice was coded as Regional Compliance Consulting. That sounded believable because compliance consulting was a real expense for us. The problem was that Paul could find no contract, no work product, no emails, and no record that anyone outside the accounting department had ever spoken to Red Clay. The payments had all been approved electronically by Eric. Paul had traced the LLC registration to a mailbox company in South Carolina, and then to a man named Jared Sloan, Eric's older cousin. My first reaction was not anger. It was disbelief so complete it felt almost childish. I kept thinking there had to be an explanation that did not involve my daughter's husband stealing from me. Then Paul found something worse. 3 of the Red Clay transfers had been followed, within 48 hours, by payments from the LLC to a credit card account held jointly by Eric and Diane, my wife. Lena put both hands flat on the table and asked me whether Diane had financial problems I knew about. I said we had a mortgage balance under $90,000, no car loans, no medical debt, and more than enough retirement savings. Paul asked whether she gambled. I said she played bridge, bought scratch-offs twice a year, and complained if I spent $40 too much on steak. He looked at me for a moment and said, "You should probably let me keep looking." At 4:20 that afternoon, he called again. Diane had opened 2 online betting accounts over the previous 18 months. He could not see every transaction without subpoenas, but the payments visible from our joint checking account and 1 credit card were already above $87,000. Some had been covered with transfers from Red Clay. Suddenly, the words Lucia overheard made sense. The old transfers were the missing company money. The Eastover warehouse sale would create a large legitimate inflow, enough to bury the smaller theft inside closing expenses, debt restructuring, and distributions if someone had temporary control of the business accounts. What did not make sense was the medical paperwork. Lena had an answer for that. If I signed a broad durable power of attorney and a management authorization, while also signing a document saying I was stepping away for medical reasons, Eric could present a story to banks, vendors, employees, and eventually a court if necessary. Thomas Avery had voluntarily turned over control because his health was declining. The documents might not survive serious legal scrutiny, but they did not need to survive forever. They only had to work long enough to move the warehouse and money. "They're not trying to prove you're incompetent today," Lena said. "They're trying to create a paper trail that makes their control look voluntary before you realize what they've done." I sat there thinking about Diane, reminding me that morning to take my blood pressure medication, Eric offering to take some responsibility off my plate, and the way both of them had laughed 2 weeks earlier when I misplaced my reading glasses and found them on top of my own head. Ordinary family moments rearranged themselves into something uglier once suspicion entered the room. That night, I went home at 8:10. Diane kissed me at the door and asked how Atlanta had been. I told her the conference was canceled, and that I had spent most of the day answering work emails from the hotel. Her eyes moved toward the kitchen for half a second. The papers Lucia photographed were gone. We ate reheated chicken at the breakfast table, and Diane talked for 10 minutes about our grandson's soccer schedule. I answered like a husband who knew nothing because I needed the people across from me to keep believing that was exactly who I was. 2 evenings later, Diane brought me a blue folder while I was watching a college football game in the den. She had changed tactics. Instead of leaving papers on the kitchen table, she sat beside me, put her hand on my knee, and said, "Eric says the insurance people need these before renewal. Mostly signatures, nothing complicated. There are sentences you hear differently once you know someone has rehearsed them." I turned down the television and took the folder. The first 9 pages were real insurance material. Pages 10 through 13 were bland corporate authorizations. Page 14 was the broad power of attorney Lucia had warned me about. Page 15 authorized Eric to act for Piedmont Fire and Safety during any temporary incapacity or voluntary medical absence. Page 16 gave authority to negotiate the Eastover warehouse. They had hidden the blade inside a stack of paper thick enough to make a tired man stop reading. Diane was watching my face, so I did something that probably surprised her more than anger would have. I read every page, slowly. When I reached the power of attorney, I tapped it with my finger and said, "Why is this in an insurance packet?" She answered too quickly. "It's standard continuity planning. Eric explained it to me." I looked at her. Why would my son-in-law need power over my personal affairs for insurance continuity? For the first time, she stopped sounding prepared. "Thomas, you're making it more dramatic than it is." "Then there's no reason not to have Lena review it." Her hand left my knee. "You call Lena for everything. That's what I pay her for." Diane stood, took the folder, and said, "Fine, forget it." Eric was trying to help. That was the moment the last part of me still hoping for an innocent explanation went quiet. If the papers were legitimate, there was no reason my attorney could not read them. I went upstairs 20 minutes later, closed the bathroom door, and texted Lena 2 words. They tried. The next morning we began moving openly but quietly. First, I signed a written revocation of every prior financial power of attorney I had ever issued, even though the only one on record was an old limited document from a surgery 12 years earlier. Lena recorded the revocation and sent copies to our banks. Second, I amended my estate plan so that Diane was no longer successor trustee of my personal trust. An independent fiduciary would serve if I truly became unable to manage my affairs, and Melissa would be co-beneficiary, but would not have unilateral control. I did that because I refused to answer one act of misplaced trust by creating another. Third, Paul and our IT contractor preserved every login log, document download, and email associated with Eric's company account before limiting his permissions to ordinary payroll functions. We made the change look like part of a security upgrade being rolled across the company. Eric complained about it at lunch. I shrugged and blamed our cyber insurer. Fourth, I made an appointment with my longtime physician, Dr. Aaron Bell. I told him exactly why I was there, including the documents describing a possible medical absence. He examined me, reviewed my records, performed a basic cognitive screening, and documented that there was no medical basis to question my ability to manage my own financial or business decisions. I remember feeling foolish sitting in that examination room, naming the date, drawing a clock, and repeating words back to a doctor who had treated me for 20 years. Then I realized that was exactly what manipulation does. It makes a sane man feel embarrassed for proving his sanity. On the fourth business day after Lucia's call, our bank fraud officer phoned Lena. Someone had submitted a request to add Eric as an unrestricted signer on Piedmont's main operating account. Attached was a scanned power of attorney bearing my name and a signature that looked almost perfect. It had one flaw. I had not signed it. Eric had not waited for me after all. When I refused the real packet, he had moved to forgery. The bank froze the request and preserved the submission. That changed everything. Up until then, we had evidence of theft and preparation. Now we had an actual forged document used in an attempt to gain financial authority. Lena told me the bank would file its required fraud reports and recommended I make a police report with the Financial Crimes Unit. I did. I sat across from a detective named Morgan Reeves and explained, piece by piece, how I had hired my son-in-law, how my wife had benefited from money moved through a shell company, and how a woman who was not related to me had been the first person brave enough to tell me what was happening. Detective Reeves did not promise arrests. She did not give me some television speech about justice. She said, "Preserve everything. Do not warn them about the investigation, and if either of them asks you to sign or destroy anything, document it." That was enough. That evening I came home and found Diane making pasta. She asked why I seemed tired. I told her I had been dealing with bank paperwork. For the first time in 34 years, I watched my wife try to decide whether my sentence contained danger for her. By the following Thursday, 8 days after Lucia's call, the financial picture was clear enough that I could no longer justify keeping Melissa in the dark. She was 32, an occupational therapist at a rehabilitation hospital, and she had inherited my mother's habit of looking straight at people when they spoke. I asked her to meet me at Lena's office without telling Eric. She arrived wearing hospital scrubs and carrying a paper cup of coffee, irritated because she assumed I was about to lecture her about retirement accounts. Then she saw the expression on my face and sat down without speaking. I told her I needed her to hear everything before she reacted. I started with Lucia's call. I showed her the photograph of the unsigned packet. I showed her the red clay transfers. I showed her the payments that had reached Diane and Eric's credit card. Finally, Lena put the forged bank authorization on the table. Melissa looked at the signature and said, "Dad, that's yours." I said, "It looks like mine." She stared at it longer, then covered her mouth. The first question she asked was not about the money. "Does Mom know?" I told her the evidence strongly suggested Diane knew and had benefited, but the investigation would determine how much she had done herself. Melissa stood and walked to the window. For several minutes, she did not say anything. Then she turned and asked, "Is this why Eric keeps asking me to refinance our house?" That was information none of us had. Over the previous 2 months, Eric had repeatedly pressured her to take cash out of their home equity, claiming he wanted to invest in a small development project with friends. She had refused because the explanation kept changing. He had also asked her twice whether I had ever been diagnosed with memory problems. She thought he was worried about me. Sitting in that room, she realized he had been collecting information. Melissa began crying, not loudly, just the kind of crying people do when they are still trying to think through something while their life is breaking. I wanted to cross the room and tell my daughter I could fix it. Fathers spend decades believing that sentence is part of the job description. But I could not fix her marriage any more than she could fix mine. I could only give her the truth early enough to protect herself. Lena helped Melissa contact her own attorney that afternoon. She also changed passwords on her personal accounts and put an alert on her credit. She did not go home to Eric that night. She stayed with a coworker and texted him that the hospital had called her in for an overnight shift. I hated the deception, but by then deception was already the environment we were trying to get out of safely. Paul's deeper review found that the company theft was slightly worse than the first estimate. Red Clay had received $247,300, and another $31,000 had been disguised through inflated equipment reimbursements. The combined problem was still small relative to the value of Piedmont, but that was not the point. Theft does not become less personal because the victim can afford it. The motive behind the Eastover property also came into focus. Eric had prepared draft closing documents to sell the warehouse to an investor group for $1.42 million. The buyer appeared legitimate and may not have known anything was wrong. Eric's plan, judging from emails recovered from his laptop backup, was to pay company debts at closing, shift a large management reserve to an account he controlled under the forged authority, then used some of that money to replace the cash he had stolen before anyone conducted a full audit. Diane's betting losses had helped start the hole. Eric's theft had widened it. Their attempt to control me was supposed to close it. I read one message from Diane to Eric that I still remember word for word, though I wish I did not. She had written, "If Thomas thinks this is about his health, he'll be embarrassed enough to cooperate." That sentence hurt more than the money. My wife knew me well enough to understand what would frighten me. She knew I had watched my father spend his final years with dementia. She knew the possibility of losing my judgment scared me more than losing a building, and she was willing to use that fear as a lever. The next morning I moved my passport, personal financial records, spare keys, and medications out of the house and into a secure cabinet at Lena's office. Lucia had not returned since the warning call because I refused to put her in the middle. I paid her as usual and told her to stay home until I said otherwise. She apologized as if she had caused the trouble. I told her, "Lucia, you didn't break anything. You turned on the light." She started crying, and that almost broke me, because there was something upside down about the most loyal person in the situation being the one who felt guilty. Meanwhile, Eric still believed the bank authorization was moving through normal review. Our fraud officer had told him only that the change required additional verification. By Friday afternoon, he sent me an email asking for a family strategy meeting Monday morning about the company, my health, and the Eastover warehouse. I forwarded it to Lena. She called me 10 seconds later and said, "Let him have his meeting." Monday morning at 9, I walked into Piedmont Fire and Safety's main conference room wearing the same Navy sport coat I had worn to my retirement dinner from the fire department 15 years earlier. I chose it because I needed one small thing that morning to remind me who I had been before any of these people tried to redefine me on paper. Eric was already there with a laptop, a legal pad, and 3 folders arranged neatly in front of him. Diane sat to his right. She looked tired but determined. Melissa was not there. Eric assumed she was at work. In reality, she was in Lena's office, 2 floors above us with her own attorney, waiting to speak with investigators later that day. Eric began in the smooth voice I had heard him use with lenders. "Tom, we need to have a difficult conversation, and I want you to understand this is coming from love." I almost admired the preparation. He spoke about stress, my age, how hard I had worked, how sometimes strong men did not notice when they needed to slow down. Diane reached for my hand. I left mine on the table. Eric continued. He said the Eastover sale would reduce pressure, free up cash, and allow him to take over day-to-day financial management while I focused on my health. Then, he slid a folder toward me. "Most of this is administrative," he said. "We can walk you through the signature pages." I looked at the folder but did not open it. "Before we do that," I said, "I brought a few things of my own." Lena entered the room. Eric's face changed before he could stop it. Behind her came Paul, carrying one banker's box. I had not invited the bank fraud officer or police detective because this was not a stage show and I did not want to pretend a criminal investigation existed for my satisfaction. The evidence was enough. Lena sat beside me. Paul remained standing near the screen. I placed the forged bank authorization in front of Eric. "Do you recognize this?" I asked. He glanced at it and said, "Looks like something from the estate package. It was submitted to my bank 6 days ago." Diane looked at Eric. He said nothing. "The signature is forged," I continued. "The bank preserved the submission. They also preserved the login records attached to it." Eric leaned back. "Tom, you don't understand how electronic authorizations work." "Maybe not," I said. "That's why I brought people who do." Paul put a spreadsheet on the screen showing the red clay payments. 7 transfers appeared in one column, followed by linked movements into personal accounts. Eric's color disappeared slowly, almost scientifically. Diane said, "Thomas, please, this is not what you think." I looked at her and asked the question I had carried for 10 days. "Then tell me what I should think when company money pays your gambling debt." Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Eric stood and said we needed to stop the meeting until everyone had counsel. Lena answered, "That is the first sensible thing you've said this morning." He looked at me then, and the performance finally dropped. "You were going to leave Melissa the company anyway," he said. "We were protecting what should stay in the family." There it was. Not denial, just entitlement with a nicer shirt on. I said, "Melissa is my family. You stealing from her father does not become family planning because you married her. Diane began crying. She said the betting had gotten away from her, that Eric had offered to move money temporarily, that she thought the warehouse sale would put everything back before I ever knew. And the power of attorney? I asked. She wiped her face. You would have fought the sale. Yes. We were desperate. I nodded because that part at least, I believed. Desperate people ask for help, Diane. They do not manufacture a weaker version of the person standing in their way. Eric pushed the folder away and said, nothing actually happened. The warehouse never sold. I slid another document across the table. It was the confirmation that the bank had rejected his forged authorization and referred the matter for investigation. Something happened the moment you used my name to get authority I did not give you. I told him his access to Piedmont had been terminated effective that morning. I told Diane I had moved out of the house temporarily and that all communication about our finances would go through attorneys. Then I told both of them that I had already made a report to the Financial Crimes Unit and had turned over the records we legally possessed. I did not tell them whether anyone would be arrested. I did not threaten them. I did not need to. For 10 days they had believed the power in the room came from keeping me uninformed. Once that advantage disappeared, so did most of their confidence. Eric asked where Melissa was. I said, safe. That was the only answer he received from me. Diane looked at Lena, then at Paul, then back at me and whispered, is there any way we come back from this? I thought about 34 Christmas mornings, hospital waiting rooms, mortgages, arguments, vacations, the day Melissa was born, and the hundreds of ordinary evenings that make up a marriage long before anyone imagines its ending. I did not hate my wife. That would have been simpler. I still loved part of the woman I had believed she was, and that made the next sentence harder, not easier. I don't know what forgiveness will look like someday, I told her. But trust cannot survive on a forged signature. Then I stood and left the room before either of them could turn my grief into another negotiation. The criminal investigation took months, which is how these things happen in the real world when paperwork matters more than speeches. Investigators obtained records we never could have accessed on our own, including banking information from Red Clay and messages Eric thought he had deleted. Prosecutors eventually filed charges involving the forged authorization, the diverted company funds, and the attempt to obtain control through false documents. Eric's attorney negotiated a plea rather than take the entire record to trial. He admitted to the financial theft and the forged bank submission, agreed to restitution, and lost the professional credentials that had made it possible for me to trust him with company finances in the first place. Diane's role was smaller but not imaginary. She had not created Red Clay, but she had accepted money, helped conceal the debt, and participated in preparing the papers meant to obtain my signature. Her case ended with a separate agreement that included restitution and court supervision. I will not pretend any of that felt like victory. Watching your wife sit beside a lawyer because of something she did to you does not feel like winning. Watching your daughter separate from the father of your grandson does not feel like winning either. Melissa eventually filed for divorce. She moved into a townhouse 15 minutes from me and rebuilt her life without asking me to fix it for her. My grandson stayed close to both of us, and we made one family rule that I am proud of. Adults could tell the truth without recruiting a child into their anger. Diane and I divorced the following year. I kept Piedmont Fire and Safety, not because I cared more about the company than the marriage, but because the company had been built by hundreds of honest paychecks, employees, inspections, apprentices, and customers who had nothing to do with what happened inside my house. I hired an outside controller, added dual approval for major transfers, and stopped treating trust as a substitute for controls. Trust is valuable. Verification is not an insult to it. That was a lesson I should have learned in the fire service. We never assumed a building was safe because someone we liked said it was. We checked the exits, tested the alarms, and looked behind the wall. Somehow I had believed family deserved a different standard. Lucia eventually came back to work 2 days a week, although by then work was not the right word for what existed between us. The first morning she returned, she walked into my smaller rental house carrying the same canvas tote she had carried when she cared for my mother. She looked around the kitchen and asked whether I wanted the coffee mugs in the left cabinet or the right. I started laughing because after months of attorneys, audits, police interviews, and paperwork, that ordinary question felt like medicine. I told her wherever she thought they belonged. She pointed at me and said, "No, Mr. Avery, you choose. That is the point now." I never forgot that. A few weeks later, I learned she still owed a little under $31,000 on the small house she had bought with her husband before he died. I paid the balance. She argued with me for 3 days, said it was too much, said she had only made a phone call. I told her that phone call had protected a business employing 43 people, a daughter who deserved the truth, and an old man who had almost signed away his own authority because he trusted the wrong table. "I'm not paying you for calling me," I said. "I'm thanking you for being the one person in the house who was willing to lose something by telling me the truth." She finally accepted on one condition. I stopped calling myself an old man until I turned 70. I agreed. I am 68 now, so she still has 2 years left to enforce it. I do not spend much time wondering whether I should have noticed sooner. That question can eat a person alive, because betrayal always looks obvious after someone turns the lights on. Before that, the same facts look like errands, paperwork, fatigue, family favors, and little explanations you have no reason to challenge. What matters is what you do after the truth becomes visible. If you are a husband, a wife, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, or a grandparent listening to me, do not confuse calm with weakness, and do not confuse suspicion with wisdom either. Love the people you love. Give them room to be human. But read what you sign. Know who can touch your accounts. Protect your name. And pay attention to the people whose loyalty shows up in small, boring ways long before there is a crisis. The person who saves your life may not be the one sitting beside you in family photographs. Sometimes it is the person standing near the laundry room door, risking her job to make one phone call because she cannot watch someone decent walk blindly into a trap. I lost a marriage after Lucia called me that Tuesday evening, but she did not destroy it. She simply stopped me from signing my name beneath a lie that had already been written without me.